Hey, this is Joe, Gray Bench Electronics. Welcome back to the pedal teardown series where I take apart new and interesting pedals and show you what's going on inside. Today we have the Kingtone Vintage Fuzz. All right, Kingtone Vintage Fuzz. So another boutique fuzz face showing up on the channel. This one, as far as I know, is not really available anymore. It appears is on the Kingtone website, but I think it's been out of stock for a while. Interesting take on a fuzz face. We have switches here. This is probably the most interesting part. Switches here that selects for different part number germanium transistors in the fuzz face circuit. Fuzz face, of course, is a very simple circuit, 13 components, and 2 of those are transistors. Traditionally, they're PNP germanium transistors, and that's what's on offer here. In the left position for both switches is an AC128 PNP germanium, and over on the right is a NKT275 PNP germanium. You can mix and match, of course. I'd assume the top switch is for Q1 and bottoms for Q2, but we can double check that when we're inside. We, of course, being a fuzz face, have our volume and fuzz controls. There is a sort of hidden little bias control here that you can, with some amount of difficulty, turn back and forth to adjust the bias, presumably on Q2 collector resistance for that bias control. Latching foot switch. The panel here is a sort of like a plastic sheet adhered on that has the graphics, and then it's just sort of stuck on. DC jack polarity sign here is, I believe, laser etched. That's going to be the same back here for the Kingtone serial number and Jesse Davies signature. Input and output jacks are side mounted. DC jack is the Kobe Con style with the internal nut. Sort of an interesting looking LED there, or sort of a flat face with the LED pointed up. 1590 BB size enclosure. Looks like a Hammond enclosure. It's got that sort of smoother exterior finish to it. Let's go ahead and crack open the pedal. All right, so here is the inside of the Kingtone Vintage Fuzz. This one is marked version 1.6. So being a fuzz face, it's a pretty empty looking board. We have our 2 sets of germanium transistors here. On the left here are the AC128s. These are the tongue SRAM AC128s, and on the right are the NKT275. Now, of course, these aren't the vintage NKT275s that you'll find in like the original fuzz faces. These are the same NKT275 that you can find on the Dunlop fuzz faces that say they had them. You can actually still buy sets of 10 of these, I think, on eBay from a seller like Mini Flux One, something like that, out of Germany. I don't know much about these transistors besides the fact that they're not the vintage ones. I think I read that Mike Pierre said they are made in America, but for some reason they're being sold from a person in Germany. I don't know much about other than, you know, they're not the vintage ones, they're not made by Newmarket. The tongue SRAM ones, these are original tongue SRAM AC128s. These were fairly widely available up until a year or 2 ago. As far as the markings, so you can see here, this AC128, so hopefully you can see here, they're marked VI, and that was how tongue SRAM did the gain ranges. They came in like V, VI, VII, and that was sort of like rough gain buckets. VI was sort of the middle high gain, and you're going to find these a lot in fuzz faces because that's right where that 80 to 120 HFE gains fell. Not sure what the HFEs for these are going to be. Probably not deviating significantly from the generally recommended HFEs of 80 for Q1 and 120 for Q2. Battery snap right here in the middle and a space cut out for it on the PCB. The input jacks are the Rian style open jacks. And they have these sort of interesting little jumper cables going over to the switches, so no wires, just these sort of straight solid core wire connecting the two, which is fine. We have a couple electrolytics here. This one is 100 microfarad, probably just for power filtering. This one here is a 47 microfarad, which is, considering its proximity to the drive control, which would be like the fuzz control in a fuzz face. This is probably the bypass capacitor for the emitter resistance for Q2. Interesting that they went with a double the normal capacitance at 47 microfarads, usually a 20 or a 22. Over here we have where the battery snap connects, and there's a little jumper piece here. You can actually pull this little red piece out and move it over, and that's to either connect the battery in, or I should say the DC jack in through what I believe to be some little circuit that's supposed to simulate a battery. At least that's what the ad copy says. Or you can move this little jumper over and say that you're connecting like an external battery box in through the DC jack, and then it doesn't go through that circuit. Over here we have the 2.2 microfarad, almost definitely the input cap. Foot switch soldered into the board. This is the PCB mounted bias control. Over here is our dropper resistor for the LED, I believe. Felt that up, yeah, it's going to the LED. We also have some dip switches over here. These are two options here for bass response. You can push it to the up position and get fat. Down position is vintage. And the other outside here is the output, and up is vintage, down is boost. A couple caps here. We have 100 nanofarad and a 10 nanofarad. So like all fuzz faces, it's always interesting to see where stuff gets biased coming out of the box. So let's pull out the multimeter and check bias on these. So of course this pedal does have a variable bias control, so we're just gonna set that to the middle, which is usually where you wanna put it, because that's probably where pedal builders expect people to keep it, unless otherwise instructed. And of course we have a PNP based pedal here, which means we're going to have negative ground, or excuse me, we're going to have positive ground. And it's also worth pointing out that the pedal does in fact have reverse polarity. So the positive is usually on the sleeve of the DC jack, but now it's expected to be on the pin or the tip, and negative is on the sleeve. And that's having to do with, it's a couple factors. It's the PNP transistors, but also the switching scheme that's usually set up between the input jack, allowing you to turn on and off the battery with that. So let's make it easy, and we're just going to install a battery. Actually, first off, let's test my battery here. So 9.5 volts on the battery. Let's pop the battery in. All right, battery's in. Pop in an input jack, and our pedal is on. Bias control's in the middle. So let's see where the collectors are sitting. PCB has a nice bias test point here, which is cool. So 3.4 volts, that's interesting. It's a little lower than you expect to see. Usually you want to bias about halfway through the power supply, which is around 4.5 volts. Of course, we can make that happen if we, probably can't clip onto there, but if I manipulate that bias control, go a little further. Yeah, so that's 4.9 is about where the sun face was biased. So let's look at that. So for this pedal with these AC 128s, right about 130 or so is roughly middle biased. Let's switch over to the NKT 275s. Okay, 6.92, so that's a little high. Let's wind that back a bit, just a little more. So there's 4.5. So for the NKT 275s, somewhere around here, like 9:30, 10 o'clock or so, will give you about middle bias. Let's just, for testing purposes, see what the collector is for Q1. So Q1 collector for the NKT 275 is about 0.43 volts. Usually it's like to see, I shouldn't say like to see, but usually you do see more like 0.7 volts. Let's switch over to the AC 128s. And that's right at 0.7 volts there. So that's the inside of the Vintage Fuzz from Kingtone. Sort of a modern take on a fuzz face with some interesting control over the power supply, the different controls of the bass response and the output. And you can also obviously switch between two different sets of transistors, which is probably the main draw to this. Let's go ahead and put the pedal back together. All right, that was a teardown on the Kingtone Vintage Fuzz. If you have any questions or recommendations for a pedal you want to see on a future teardown episode, let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate you hitting the like button and subscribing, and hit the notification bell if you want to know when I make a new video. I'm Joe from Graybench Electronics. Thank you for watching.